Hi guys. So as people were just talking about, actually, quick note about some of the Brian stuff. That's actually what I learned how to do forensics on, was SleuthKit and Autopsy. Love those two products. What I wanted to talk about today is the benefits of visualizing some of your security data. There's a lot of vendors out in the market right now that are trying to profit off of visualization, and there's a good reason for that. It's extremely easy to understand data that's visually represented. As humans, we're very pattern recognition oriented, right? When you look at something that's full of patterns, you're going to be able to detect things straight off the bat. The little things are just going to click for you. You might not even understand why, but your eyes are going to get drawn to certain aspects of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a quick example. I got 15 minutes, so I can't get into a ton of information on it, but I'm going to show you a quick and easy way to take open source data. And by open source, I mean data that you collect on your network via an open source product, and use more fun open source products in order to visualize it, in order to find something bad, and also explain it and justify it to management of why it's bad and why you get to spend all your time on it. So tools that I use in this talk, Bro, which is open source. You can yum install it if you want. How many people here have used Bro before? Okay. How about Security Onion, or all these other cool tools that incorporate Bro without telling you, unless you read their documentation, right? Bro is extremely prolific in the security community, whether or not it's an actual open source product or if it's a proprietary product that just happens to be using it. Graphviz is another cool open source product. It's a complete visualization tool. Basically, you create a config file, and based on that config file, it creates pretty pictures for you. Every report I have, it's almost all data. Every executive summary is all pretty pictures. You can kind of understand the difference of your target audience and why you need both in your reports. I use Python, which everybody probably is pretty familiar with what Python is. I use 10 lines of code to do all of this. So, and that cool URL there, that's my GitHub, son of a glitch. It's got a ton of code and stuff up there. If you want to use any of it, be my guest. This project I'm going to continue working on and posting updates to it. If you want to fork it, go for it. And last but not least, I'm doing all this on Linux because I didn't want to pay for anything. That's really about the only reason. So first things first, who can read everything on this slide? Well, this is only 10 lines of a log file that comes out from JSON. It's pretty hard to read, even the really bad coloring. But what I'm trying to get across is that's what you have to hunt with right now. You get a gigantic text file. Even though I've formatted this to be in JSON format and make it more easily readable, this is what you get with most open source software for trying to hunt. It's really hard. It takes hours to go through. And normally you're either writing your own parsers to get through this data, or you're taking this and you're importing it into something like Excel. Then you're doing cell stacking, or you're doing some kind of pivot tables or some kind of manual analysis. Once you get that and you start getting some numbers, some metrics, well, now you got to go back in and do it all over again on the next file, on the next file, on the next file, and hopefully eventually you're going to correlate something, right? When you're looking at this data, you're trying to answer three basic questions. Was anything beaconing? Where did it beacon? And is it a legitimate beaconing or not, right? Was it Spotify checking in at home, or was it this new fun WannaCry, or one of the other millions of things that came out over the weekend? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of those little JSON event lines, which expanded out gives me all these different fields. I'm going to toss it through my 10 lines of Python and outport a Graphviz config file. And then from there, I'm going to create something that looks like this relationship graph. Right? What this allows me to do is this allows me to answer those three questions. This tells me, what systems are beaconing out. Well, I have my internal IPs. These are a 192 subnet, 192.168 subnet. It could be 172, was it 172.16 something or 10./8. It could be anything like that for internal. And then I have external. Where is it going to? And finally, I'm trying to ask, is it legitimate or not? Well, that comes down to a lot of questions. How often is it happening? How big is the data? All these type of aspects. What does the URL even resolve to? Anything along those lines. Right now, what I've done is I've taken that giant log file and I've created edges and entities inside that data. I've very quickly taken that giant log file and started to create those relationships already visually. But what this doesn't tell me is how often are things talking together or why I care about those relationships. So what I can do is I can add in some frequency analysis. This is a simple extra couple lines of code in Python, and all it's doing is it's counting specific things in that log file. In this case, I'm looking for specific destination addresses. And in Graphviz, I change one line, and now things that have a certain count get a certain width. So I'm taking that same visualization, and now I'm thickening some of the lines between them. This very quickly and easily tells me there's a relationship between these two items that I should go look at first because it's prominent in my data. Now, the conditions that I used were pretty rudimentary because I wanted to show it with a very, very small data set, but you can get very complex in how you want to define those relationships. And what's great is you get to control all that definition. You get to decide every little thing that you consider important and not important in that data. Now, what I'm doing is I'm able to define all three of those questions. So why is this kind of important? Well, just looking at that graph by itself, that visualization, do you get right off the bat that there's two things I need to look at, right? I see a couple heads nodding. Which graph did you prefer? Did you prefer the one without the arrows? Did you prefer the one with the thicker arrows? Thicker? Yeah. So is that something that you would end up creating manually in your report to your boss to show all this different traffic? For me, yes, it is one of the things that I commonly have in one of my reports. So the last 15 years or so, I've been running security operations for different companies and building out their SOCs and doing incident response. This is almost always one of the one of the sections of the reports that I write up is a visual relationship graph. Now, this is either traffic, so I can say host 123 beaconed out to some place in China and it sent 2 gigs of data. Yes, you had data exfiltration. Here's all the other hosts that it talked to. Here's all the other hosts in scope. Here's the usernames that were on each host, et cetera, et cetera. And what it would be is each one of these circles is what I call an entity. And based off that entity, I add contextual data. And that's what I built the visual relationship graph off of that I would send into management or the customer. What I'm doing is basically the poor man's version of that and use 10 lines of code and some free tools to make that so much quicker. Why this matters is cost analysis. I took something that manually takes me 8 hours. And I know these numbers because this is what I actually timed myself at. So if any of you really hate yourselves and have no weekend, you can repeat this experiment and see what your numbers are. What I did is I did the manual analysis. I went through all the log files. I used, I didn't use Google Docs because pivot table sucks in it. And I didn't use Excel because I had to say everything was free to fit into the gap. So what I used was LibreOffice. Libre. It's the free one that gets installed in most Linux distros, whichever you prefer to call it. And I used some pivot tables in there. And in the end, it took me about 8 hours to go through all the data that I had. At the end of those 8 hours, I had my visual representation graph, and I wrote up a mini report that I would have submitted to my boss. So looking at what hourly rates are for certain people for different securities, I would say this is work for a junior analyst or mid-range analyst, and they make on average $50 an hour. So doing this one search is roughly $400 a day. By writing 20 lines of Python and using 2 tools, I did the exact same analysis in half that time, 4 hours, because I was able to create these relationships and it helped give me shortcuts. I was able to cut out a lot of that data that I was looking at and concentrate just on the relationships. Saved myself half the time, cost half as much money to the customer or client. But once I added that frequency analysis portion, that extra 4 lines of code, and created those thicker arrows, I cut it down to 2 hours. And that's just because, well, I really suck at PowerPoint, and that's how long it took me to make that picture. So theoretically, I just charge my boss 1/4 of the price. Does that sound like something your boss would agree with? Because that's what I'm trying to go after, is how can I justify doing this work, right? The extra, that script took me, I think the entire thing, installing all the applications, including the OS, and writing the script took me an hour, doing it start to finish. And yes, it's very, very small because I was aiming at a small data set, but think about that. You invest that hour ahead of time. I learned some new tools. I learned a couple new techniques. And now I'm costing myself 1/8 the price of what I was doing previously. So, questions. And yes, that is my face on there. If you guys go onto Sqrrl's website and check out their threat hunter profiles, this is what I actually submitted to them. That and my resume says Times Person of the Year 2006. If any of you get that reference, if not, Google it. So yeah, questions, comments, concerns. I take compliments. Cool. I'm just gonna hand that.
All right, well, thank you, Ryan.